Welcome to the Capital Forum's interview series, presented by Kroll On Track. My name is Ben Newmeyer, and today I'm delighted to have here with me Joel Winston, a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of Hudson Cook, and previously an associate director in the Division of Financial Practices at the Federal Trade Commission. Joel, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to dive right into the CFPB's recent actions in the auto finance industry, especially the Bureau's settlement with Herbie's, a buy here, pay here dealer in Colorado. What does this case tell us about the CFPB's approach to the auto finance industry, both in terms of what it perceives as the consumer harms and how it's going to go about resolving them?
I think we're learning a lot of things through this one small case. One is the willingness of the CFPB to bring cases against the very small companies. This was a one-store used car dealer in Colorado, which I think in the past the federal agencies would probably not have gone there just because of its size. But the CFPB felt a willingness to do that. I think a second thing we see here is a willingness to push the envelope on legal theories. The case involves some Truth in Lending Act violations, but also some allegations of unfair deceptive practices that were, I would say, unusual, to say the least. Third, we're seeing a real willingness on the part of the Bureau to be aggressive in terms of its remedies. The order in the case required Herbie's to pay back $700,000 to consumers who had bought their cars from them, even though the evidence in the case indicated that consumers really weren't harmed at all by what Herbie's did. They were also penalized. So they're being very aggressive, I think, both in their selection of cases and in the remedies that they're seeking.
So this comes in a field where the FTC already has some jurisdiction. What is the FTC's jurisdiction here, and how do the agencies divide up how they're going to police the industry?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I guess the answer to the last question is not so clear how they divide things up. It's true they have overlapping jurisdiction in the auto dealer space. Buy here, pay here dealers, both agencies have jurisdiction. The franchise dealers, the new car dealers, only the FTC. So I think one thing you're seeing is the CFPB being very aggressive in the space where they do have jurisdiction. So they are bringing cases against used car dealers. There is a memorandum of understanding between the two agencies by which they're supposed to cooperate and kind of not step on each other's turf, which, from what I understand, talking to people in both agencies, is working reasonably well. But there has been, I think, some concerns that have been raised about duplication of efforts, about the two agencies kind of horning in on the other. And from the industry standpoint, it's kind of hard to tell, who's coming from where. But at least in this particular space, it could be either agency.
So I guess the saying goes that when you have two agencies responsible for one thing, well, stakeholders should just expect nothing to get done. Is this what you're telling clients, or are you telling them that they should be even more concerned about what they're doing legally?
I think even more concerned. Now, the two main principles of this memorandum of understanding are supposed to be: we don't duplicate efforts. If one agency is bringing a case, the other one stays away. And we don't issue inconsistent interpretations of the law. We try to be consistent. Well, that hasn't worked as well as it should, I think. There has been some duplication, and there have been some instances where the agencies were taking somewhat different positions. So I think from the industry standpoint, they're facing potential prosecution from both the FTC and the CFPB, and of course, you've got state attorneys general who've traditionally been active in this space, so it could really be coming from any place. One example I guess I would give is the area of data security. So this is an area that the FTC really kind of invented, the requirement that companies that collect consumers' personal information actually safeguard it and keep it from harm. The FTC really began this program maybe 15 years ago and has brought, I think, over 60 cases now. They've really been the leaders in government in the data security space. And so one thing that would have made sense, I think, is for the CFPB to say, okay, FTC, that's your area. There are other areas where we, the CFPB, can be more effective. For example, going after banks where the FTC does not have jurisdiction. But just a couple of weeks ago, the CFPB brought its first data security case, and it's really exactly the kind of case the FTC traditionally brings, could have brought. The message, I think, then goes out to the industry, we've been spending all of our efforts to comply with what the FTC wants us to do. Now we've got another agency we have to deal with.
So you mentioned inconsistent interpretations. Now, as a practitioner who's been on both sides of the table before, how is the CFPB's approach to policing the auto finance industry specifically different from that of the FTC?
Well, I think in broad strokes, it's the same. They pursue cases, individual cases. That's how they establish principles. That's how they get messages out to industry that they need to bring their actions into compliance. And so both agencies really kind of follow that. But I certainly have seen some differences. I've seen the CFPB take very aggressive positions in terms of the law and how they interpret the law. I certainly have seen the CFPB be very aggressive in requiring companies to pay up very substantial penalties, substantial consumer redress, more so than the FTC has. Traditionally, the FTC has only required monetary relief in cases where there was pretty serious misconduct, although I will say that's changing some. They're being a little bit more aggressive. But the CFPB's policy, it appears to be, is they have to get substantial money in every case, no matter how technical the violations might be, no matter whether there was consumer injury or not. So there are some differences. I would say over time there's going to be some convergence. Now, the CFPB is 4.5 years old. The FTC is 102 years old. So you're going to have to expect some differences in how they go about things. And I think the FTC's processes are a little bit more predictable than the CFPB's at this point.
So speaking of, you mentioned the age of the two agencies. And looking at the timeline here, we're approaching the final year of the Obama administration. What should we expect to see from the CFPB as this current term winds down?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and I think it all depends on what happens with the election. At this point, the CFPB has been quite strident in its self-defense. There have been hearings on a weekly basis up before the House Financial Services Committee and the Senate, where the director of the CFPB, Richard Cordray, is beaten up on a regular basis. But they really haven't backed off at all. They've really continued to press their agenda, perhaps on the theory of let's make hay while the sun shines. That could all change as a result of the election. If we get a Republican president and a Republican House and Senate, I would predict there will be some pretty serious cutbacks in the CFPB's powers and its structure. I think it's likely they would be made into a commission rather than a single director. I think it's likely that they would be brought within congressional appropriations, which they're not now. And some of their powers would probably be cut back pretty substantially. Not to mention the fact that you'll have a new director appointed by a Republican president. Unlike the FTC, where you have a lot of continuity from administration to administration, the commissioners all have staggered terms, and usually only one is replaced at a time, and you still have 4 holdovers. With the CFPB, you could go from one extreme to the other in a matter of a day.
So moving to the question of process, looking at things more broadly, how are the agencies different on how they conduct and resolve investigations?
Again, broadly speaking, the processes are the same. The CFPB's rules of practice are based quite a bit on the FTC, not entirely, but are similar. I think the differences, though, are in practice rather than in what's in the books. The CFPB has issued civil investigative demands routinely at the beginning of investigations. They really haven't made any attempt to get information voluntarily, like the FTC does sometimes. Their CIDs tend to be extremely broad. They ask for everything. They tend to be, it appears, at least from the outside, as if they're just fishing. They're looking to see whether there's something they can find that might be wrong. There's also been kind of a lack of transparency. I have found it frustrating when I represent clients in trying to find out what the CFPB's concerns might be. Generally, they won't tell me. And if you can put yourself in the shoes of a small auto dealer in Greeley, Colorado, for example, having to spend a year or two responding to a series of CIDs, asking for everything they have, hiring lawyers to represent them and protect them, and basically being bled dry. And I will say, though, on a positive note, I see some changes at the CFPB. They're, I think, becoming, again, more like the FTC in their willingness to be reasonable about these investigations, to be a little more transparent, to be willing to negotiate with the company on a more limited production of documents and such. So I'm optimistic that over time, the CFPB is 4.5 years old, and sometimes they act like a 4-year-old. But they're maturing, and I think over time things will get better.
So you mentioned the structure of the CFPB and the fact that they have such a broad approach to issuing CIDs. Now, how do these agencies' structure and its process for review affect how companies actually deal with the CID if it's something they don't want to answer?
In both cases, the company has the right to file a petition to quash or limit the CID. In both cases, those petitions are heard by the agency heads. Again, in the CFPB's case, it's one guy. Mm-hmm. It's the same guy who issued the CID in the first place. And I think, as we've seen in the petitions that have been filed and responded to, there hasn't been much effort to really take into account the company's concerns. In both cases, the final appeal is to a federal court, so there at least is that protection. But more broadly, I think having a single director, it really is a different animal entirely. Again, it's the same guy who's filing the lawsuit, who's actually deciding it, at least an administrative lawsuit. Even if if the director's decision after the litigation is appealed, the Court of Appeals has to give deference to the findings of the agency. So the deck is kind of stacked. With the FTC, it's a little bit different. Congress, in its wisdom, did not give the FTC the authority to get any sort of monetary relief through the administrative process. Instead, the FTC has to go to an actual court and convince the federal court judge to do that, which I think is actually a good constraint.
So I believe we have time for one more question. So we're now seeing in the appeal of the PHH case before the DC Circuit, for the first time, a constitutional challenge to the agency structure seems to be gaining traction with a major federal court of appeal. If the CFPB is forced to make structural changes as a result of an adverse ruling, what change to the structure do you think would be the best for consumers and stakeholders?
It's an interesting case. There have been prior challenges to the constitutionality of the agency in various ways, but this is kind of unique. And it's based on the notion that a single director who cannot be removed by the president at will is unconstitutional. It's sort of an administrative law 101 issue. And the Court of Appeals just recently suggested certain questions that it had going into the argument phase, and really focused on that issue. I think if PHH is ultimately successful, then Congress will have to go back and make this into a commission structure. As I said, I think that's all to the good, that a commission structure works much better and is much fairer to the industry than having a single director who can sort of decide whatever he wants at his own whim.
Well, I believe that's all the time we have. Thank you again so much for joining us, and thank you for watching. I'm Ben Newmeyer.